Hi, this is Eric Bourne with Harrisburg Area Community College, and we're going to be looking right here at some terminology to help us with classical argument essays. We'll be working with terminology derived from the Tolman method. You'll find a detailed description of this in your textbook. What we'd like to do is really understand and work with this terminology so that it'll help us structure our essays for this final project of this semester. Now, the terminology is rather difficult. This requires some distinctions that you might not be used to. The level of thought here is rather complex. To help us dive into this, I am going to turn to my good old friend, Microsoft Paint. We are going to let these nice colorful little images try to give us our basic understanding of how a few of these terms relate to each other. First off, let's think about the claim, this nice big yellow piece right here. Now, the claim is the centerpiece of your essay. It's the biggest thing on this page here because it's the most important. Everything else revolves around it. Loosely, you can think of a claim as your thesis. Those terms are very close to each other. But in terms of what your essay does, the claim, while describing the whole essay, doesn't necessarily describe what you do in the whole essay. The body of your essay focuses on what we call grounds. And now, as we're going to try to display visually here, grounds support your thesis. They are ideas, arguments, evidence which hold up your claim, which make it persuasive, which make it believable, which demonstrate to your audience why it is that you believe the way that you believe. And they're kind of like table legs in this regard. Now, the relationship between the claim and its grounds is quite particular, and one that we're definitely going to be thinking about throughout this presentation. The third major piece of this puzzle is the idea of the warrant. The warrant is a guarantee, a description of the relationship between the ground and claim, showing that the two do actually support each other. They're not sort of just held side by side. We're thinking about the logic, we're thinking about the connection that shows our reader this connection. And when all things are working together, we have a solid argument. We have something that is capable of being quite persuasive. Alright, let's take some of these ideas and let's bring them to a more detailed analysis. Let's give ourselves some good definitions and follow through with some examples. Try to give that visual representation a bit more heft, a bit more intellectual rigor. The major terms we're going to focus on in this presentation are claims, grounds, and warrants. And again, all these are regarding the Tolman method from your textbook. Now, the essay type that we're looking at is called a classical argument essay. And broadly, classical argument essays connect the main idea to the supporting arguments in a specific way and are organized around these connections. There's a particular relationship between what happens in the body paragraphs to the main thesis that is characteristic of the classical argument. Understanding this connection and developing this organization requires this new terminology that we started with in my lovely little Microsoft Paint document there. We're going to focus on the following terms. We're going to talk about a claim, we're going to talk about grounds, warrants, modal qualifiers, and rebuttals. Let's start with the claim. The most important part of the classical argument essay is the claim. It is central. You can think of it like the thesis. It's that main point. It's the one thing that your essay primarily asserts. Everything else supports it secondarily. However, because a thesis can kind of take so many forms depending on the essay type, let's talk about how this claim really appears in these essays. The first idea that we'll need to talk about is that the claim needs to be arguable. Then we'll talk about how it needs to be appropriately narrowed. And a little bit later on in the presentation, when we talk about modal qualifiers, we're going to talk about how the claim should be appropriately qualified. Let's start with this idea of arguability. A claim that is arguable, to give us a good starting definition, is a claim that reasonable people might disagree with. The claim is something that people might argue with. For that reason, I have your essays focused on debate topics, on issues on which there is disagreement between reasonable, well-meaning, thoughtful human beings. A bad example of a claim in this regard would be something like saying murderers should be punished by society for their actions. You will have to look long and hard to find someone who does not think that murderers should be punished. You really don't have something arguable here. No one's really going to debate with you. A better example is saying murderers should be punished by life in prison, not the death penalty. Here's something where there is actual debate. Here is something where Americans reasonably disagree with each other, and we're mid-process and kind of figuring out how to manage all the opinions out there on the subject. Secondly, with claims, they need to be appropriately narrowed. By narrowing, I mean that you should adjust your claim to fit the space you have to support it. You have 3 pages with some text spilling onto page 4 for this essay that I'm expecting. Your claim needs to fit that space. You don't want a claim that requires an entire book to support. Nor do you want a claim that you can trivially support within one paragraph. You want to have something that fits the space that you have. A bad example for here would be every major American city needs to support bicycling with dedicated bicycle lanes. Now think about this here. Every major American city. If you're going to make this claim, that means you need to talk about the unique challenges presented by major American cities. And clearly there are some distinct differences. Cities that have been around for hundreds of years, Boston for example, doesn't have room to expand its roads, particularly in its downtown areas. You have buildings in the way. Now go out west to something a bit more recent, I don't know, Phoenix, Arizona perhaps. And those roads out there were built to be wider. There's more space between the buildings the further you go out west in this country. There are different challenges and strengths. And if your essay is going to say every major city, you'd have to address that. You want to do a little better with the space that you have? Pick a city. Harrisburg needs to support bicycling with dedicated bicycle lanes. There you go. There is a context that you could reasonably approach in this paper. Let's turn to the idea of grounds. Grounds, you'll recall, are what supports our claim. In a classical argument essay, you establish the claim, you present your arguments, you make it persuasive to your reader, you show your reasoning by presenting evidence, reasons, and support in the body of your essay. That is the purpose of your body paragraphs, to support the claim you establish in the introduction. We call all these different types of supporting arguments and content the grounds. A few things about these grounds. First, they need to be distinctly different than the claim. Claims don't prove themselves. They are established. They are proven to a certain extent. by separate arguments, separate research, separate statements. If you cannot, in the way you formulate your essay, phrase the ground in a way that is distinctly different than your claim, then there's something missing in your understanding. Secondly, grounds need to support the claim individually and as a group. On an individual basis, each body paragraph should have a role in supporting the claim. The ground you bring up in that body paragraph needs to lead your reader to being a bit more persuaded of your claim. Also, they need to work as a group. Collectively, the claims you make should add up to a compelling case. Where there is something missing, to the extent at which your essay feels incomplete, you're going to be less successful. And finally, your grounds, similar to your claim, need to be expressible in a sentence. You need to be able to boil down these grounds to something that you can assert in the topic sentence of your body paragraphs. The connection, your organization needs to be that clear. Now, in terms of what you can do for grounds in your body paragraphs, you actually have a lot of options. Let's talk about a few. One way of supporting your claim is to present the way that you interpret some statistical research. You could present to your reader the testimony of an authority on the subject, someone who has studied and worked in the field and is likely to be respected by your reader. Sometimes an anecdote or an example. An anecdote is a brief narrative that supports a point. Sometimes these can be compelling depending on the example and depending on what else you do in the essay. And of course, the many different kinds of logical reasoning. Deductive argument, inductive argument. There are many routes that you can go in this regard. Let's use some bad examples to kind of highlight some of the ins and outs of grounds. Suppose then that you're writing an essay with the following claim. Americans should drastically limit the amount of sugar that they drink. Let's think about supporting this. The following grounds would be poor choices for this essay. First, a ground like this would really not work. The FDA has found no clear evidence connecting sugary drinks to diseases like diabetes. Now, first of all, that's not true. And secondly, it contradicts your claim. Do you see? If there's no connection between sugary drinks and diseases, that would be grounds for a claim opposite of what you're making. A little bit less clear is this one. Cane sugar is a superior alternative to high fructose corn syrup. Now, this might be true. There's certainly debate there. It's talking about sugar that we put into drinks. Okay. However, comparing two different ways of sweetening beverages tells us nothing about why we should limit the amount of sugar in what we drink. This does not lead your reader to the conclusion. It does not lead your reader to the claim. It doesn't help you establish the argument. Third, Americans have to choose between drinking soda and drinking alcohol. Clearly, soda is the superior choice. Here's an example of an attempt to use logical reasoning. This is a moment where we're presenting our reader with two options and saying that one is clearly better. However, this is poor logical reasoning. This is a bad example of a ground because the logic is deeply flawed. Americans aren't forced to choose between Coke and beer, between soda and alcohol. They have other options. They could drink water, for example. This is a bad ground because its logic has an inherent flaw. Let's go to the third idea that we looked at in that lovely little paint drawing. Let's talk about the warrants. When you're developing the grounds for your argument, you have to consider the warrants, the guarantees that your reasons, your grounds actually support the claim. You have to think about that relationship. Now, there's some oddities with warrants. Even if a ground is true, even if it's a true statement, even if it stands on its own 2 feet, it may not actually be helpful in supporting your claim. Now, when we were evaluating grounds a few minutes ago, we were actually thinking about warrants as well, in deciding what kinds of grounds were useful for the thesis. We were talking about warrants. This relationship, deciding what grounds help with our claim, is the idea of the warrant. Okay, 2 more definitions to go. We're going to look next at modal qualifiers. You'll recall that I said earlier that claims need to be appropriately qualified. Let's look at this, look at a few examples to get an idea of what it means to qualify a claim. We're going to be looking at 3 different claims that are similar but have some distinct differences. Number 1, Harrisburg should provide free preschool to all local children. Number 2, Harrisburg should provide free preschool to local children from low-income families. And third, Harrisburg should provide free preschool to local disabled children from low-income families. Notice that the group that we want to provide free preschool for changes in each example. We start with any kid in the area. Then we just talk about those kids in low-income families, and then we talk in low-income families whose children are disabled. In each case, you're talking about a shrinking group of children. Now, why would you want to pick one of these arguments over another? That depends on several things. That depends on how much space you have to talk about, for one. Perhaps you think that we need to be talking about different categories of children, or different families they come from, and we need to consider each separately. And maybe that line of thinking leads you to having a 10-page paper rather than a 4-page paper. Perhaps this is an essay that is very concerned about finances, and you recognize that Harrisburg has a limited budget. In that sense, you should be thinking about what is the cost of providing this free preschool, and maybe recognizing that your audience is going to be suspicious that Harrisburg can afford these things. You need to qualify your argument to just include a group that we could actually afford. There are many different situations that might call for your argument to be qualified. You should consider what your grounds are actually capable of supporting. If you can't make the broad, very general assertion, maybe you need to limit it depending on what kind of research you have available to you. You should qualify your argument depending on the debate surrounding the issue. What are people talking about? What are the major concerns that people have in mind? What are they going to expect you to talk about? What kind of a claim are they expecting to see? Who is your audience? Are they resistant to your point of view? Are they neutral, still figuring it out? All these things should lead you to think about, to what extent should I qualify my claim? Finally, we want to think about rebuttals. In a classical argument essay, you're expected to show that you understand all sides of the issue. You need to show your reader that you've done your research. You're aware of the various opinions surrounding the subject. You're aware of the discussion that you're entering into. To demonstrate this to your reader, you typically include a paragraph of counter-argument. In a counter-argument paragraph, you present the ideas of someone who disagrees with your claim, and then you respond specifically to their arguments. This is what we call the rebuttal, the moment where you specifically respond to the ideas of those who disagree with you. This process will help you in a couple of ways. First of all, it will convey the sense that you have done your research, that you understand your opposition. Secondly, it's going to allow discussion to appear in your essay. Presenting the words of others, explaining them, developing them, that is going to help you develop a rich, full paper. And third, if you look at the organization that I list for this essay assignment, you'll find that this counter-argument paragraph should appear as the last body paragraph of your essay. Why do I do this? Because then you'll have the conclusion as the space where you're going to want to respond to their arguments. This is going to be, if you set it up right, the easiest conclusion you've ever written. After presenting someone else's ideas, you are going to be anxious. You're going to be chafing at the bit to respond with your own ideas. And likely you're going to do so by summarizing important ideas that you've already asserted. Is that sounding suspiciously what a conclusion should do usually? This is a great strategy to help you have a conclusion that both summarizes, reminds readers of where they've been, but also feels like it's not being repetitive. It's there because it's in response to the ideas of people you disagree with. Alright folks, I believe that is enough work with definition for one day. We're going to be applying these ideas in the next few weeks of class as we prepare for this essay. These terms are very important. They're crucial to you understanding what this essay is about, so I definitely encourage you to come to class prepared to ask me questions. So, we'll see you in class.